Uh, let's get started. Thank you, everyone. Good evening, and thank you, everyone, for turning up for this Institute colloquium. So it gives me immense pleasure to introduce Professor Anindya Sinha. This is the last time I'm going to say Professor Anindya Sinha. He's more lovingly known as Rana or Rana Da. So it's going to be Rana Da from here on. So Rana Da's academic trajectory has been quite unique, and if you've seen the biography of the speaker, you would have realized that. So if I had to talk about what he did from his undergrad till right now, so I'm basically going like this. It's basically botany to cytogenetics to molecular biochemistry to classical genetics of human disease to behavioral ecology with a sprinkling of neuroscience, genetics, humanities, and sociology. It's pretty much got everything covered here. I have been one of those few fortunate ones who have interacted with Ranada and his wonderful family, who's also here. Uh, from a very young age, I've known them. And sometimes you meet certain people that you want to treat as role models, right? Um, you want to talk like them, you want to walk like them, you want to socialize like them. And when you meet Ranada, it is very easy to fall into that trap. I did that same mistake, and I'm telling you, it's a mistake because Ranada is one person who actually wears a lot of different kinds of hats. You only realize it when you know him more and more. He's not just an excellent researcher, but he's also a brilliant singer. He's a brilliant. He does a lot of drama, the theater kind, and besides that, a lot of other arts also. So it's impossible to be like him. So the only way only thing you can probably do is take a few leaves out of his book rather than be the book himself. Um, so so besides being a professor at NIAS, which is National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore, Ranada is also an adjunct faculty at Center for Neurosciences at IISc, as well as a visiting professor at Transdisciplinary University, Bengaluru. He's also been leading the Indian Biology Olympiad team for the past few years. And more recently, Ranada's research has focused towards involving alternate means in understanding non-humans in an urban landscape. And this is hopefully something that he's going to talk about today. So without further ado, Ranada.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Aniruddha, for that wonderful introduction, much of which is, I don't think, true at all. In fact, I could have just turned around to him and said, "You have also been an inspiration for me in more ways than one." And this is true for everyone, I know, because we keep learning from each other, and everyone's an inspiration for everyone else in some ways or the other. But having said that, I think it's wonderful to be here, and I also wanted to thank Pollock, who originally welcomed me into NISER when I gave a talk many years ago. And it's been wonderful to come back here. It's been kind of a homecoming, and I hope we'll be able to have more engagement, more discussions, even at the end of the talk. I'll try and keep this briefly. I'll keep this brief, but of course I tend to talk too much. And so I hope Aniruddha will shut me down at some point of time. So, yeah, so let me start with the macaques. But before I go into the macaques, I just wanted to make a couple of points that India is unique. Every country, every community, every society is unique, but India has been unique, and this is something that remains still undiscovered, unexplored to a great extent. I think the kind of philosophical exchanges or the philosophical viewpoints that people have with non humans is unique anywhere in the world. And one of the very important discoveries that many of us have made is that we have always looked at non human species. Indian traditional communities have always looked at non human species in a continuum with themselves. It's never us versus them, which I will argue is a very Western concept, but we can maybe discuss this later. And this philosophy of being in a continuum, which, if I may use the term, is rather Darwinian in some sense, but discovered thousands of years before him, also has its place in religion. And we have often respected non human beings simply because they become a part of our religious beliefs. They become icons, they become representatives of many of the gods and goddesses that we have in our country, all of which have also contributed to our respect for other beings. Now, so today I wanted to specifically talk about macaques because that's the group of individuals I've spent the greatest part of my academic life with. But I also wanted to point out to the title of being macaque. And I think that philosophically, what I want to get across to you is that the macaques have their own way. Every individual macaque has their own way of looking at the world, just as we have a way of looking at them. And when we say our complex coexistence with urban and synurbising macaques, we might as well have said our complex coexistence with urban humans, because I would like to represent the macaque's point of view. This is a viewpoint that I think none of us take into account, but this is something that is becoming increasingly important to not myself alone, but to my research team as well. Now, this is where the macaques began their lives, evolutionarily, as you all know, but they are soon finding themselves in a world which is perhaps better represented by this picture. Natural habitats are being destroyed, anthropogenic habitats are taking their place, and most non human species and populations today find themselves in a mosaic of habitats where they have to live a very, very difficult life. Now, this is true across a range of species, beginning with invertebrates up to even human communities, many of whom find themselves out of place in a very rapidly changing, urbanizing world. And again, whenever I refer to non humans, I refer to humans as well, because the problems that these communities face are very similar. We may think that we are talking only of non humans when we talk of anthropogenic habitats, urbanizing habitats, but we are also talking about many very unfortunate human communities who find themselves equally beleaguered in these situations. However, what has remained abiding is a relationship between humans and non human beings. And this is another story, another set of stories of our country that has remained unknown. This picture is taken from Charotar, which is plainlands in central Gujarat, a rice growing region, and where you have about 300 ponds, each of which is inhabited by marsh crocodiles. And what is remarkable is the 300-year or even older history of friendship. Yes, that's the term, friendship between the crocodiles and the human communities here. Here is Ramu Bhai looking at Raju, the crocodile, and Ramu Bhai has grown up with these crocodiles and he can now call out to Raju and Raju responds to him. It's a remarkable story, but this is something that is so integral to many, many communities across the country, but which are fast disappearing. And all we tend to talk about is conflict. There is conflict, of course, between humans and non humans. but there are also friendships. There are also convivial relationships. In fact, in Charotar, going back 40 years, we've only seen 4 cases of attacks of crocodiles on humans. We met 2 of the victims, and both of them said there were no deaths, and both the victims blamed themselves for the conflict. They said, we went to the den, in the denning area, and the crocodile just warned us by throwing us out. It's remarkable, the empathy that people feel, in this case for crocodiles, but what I would like to argue is across communities in India, we have this kind of empathy for other non-human species and beings as well. We've always wanted to identify with other non-humans, and there have been various ways we've done this. We've done this through our literature, through our fine arts, through our performing arts. And here, just as an example, let's look at a poem. Now, I'll just read this out in case those who are at the back can't read it. When the monkey on the bough of the jackfruit tree in the town's commons mistakes for fruit the eye on the thronged drumheads hung up there by mendicant bards, he taps on it, and the sound rouses the male swans below to answering song. It's a beautiful, very evocative poem, and I'm sure some members of the audience here will recognize immediately the beauty of the interspecies communication that is represented here, of course, mediated by the drums. So there are human beings who mediate this interspecies communication. But what is even more remarkable about this poem, which was originally written in Tamil by a poet called Muttamochiyar, was that this poem was written in what is called the Tamil Sangam period 2000 years ago. So 2000 years ago, we had a macaque or a langur living on the bough of the jackfruit tree in the town's commons. So we've been living with non-human beings for more than 2000 years, in this case perhaps a macaque. And yet, we know so little about them still. And the point also here is, therefore, we are a part of each other's ecologies. We are not necessarily intruders into a macaque's world, and neither is the macaque an intruder into our world. Whatever changes have happened have been unfortunate and has in some sense destroyed the relationship that has lived on perhaps for thousands of years and continue to do so in many of our rural areas, unknown to most of us urbanites. I won't spend too much time on the macaques, except to say that they are a remarkably versatile, diverse group of non-human primates. They have the largest geographical range, second only to humans. They are remarkably adaptable, both ecologically and behaviorally, and they show evolutionary radiation, which is again unparalleled amongst other non-human primate species. Now, here, amongst these macaques, there are 2 species, and I'm sure they are familiar to both of you, to all of you. And this is the rhesus macaque and the bonnet macaque. And I have called them here the anthropophilic macaques because they have this remarkable ability to adapt to anthropogenic habitats. And what is even more interesting is, if given a choice, both these species tend to move towards human habitations rather than remain in their so-called natural forested environments. But what this therefore leads to is an intense relationship that humans have with these species, and one end of this is of conflict, but the other end, which is perhaps much more prevalent, and I'll talk about this briefly later, is the kind of abiding cooperative, collaborative relationship that you have with them. I also want to point out that these 2 species, along with the long-tailed macaques, one subspecies of which we find in the Nicobar Islands, have been called the weed macaques traditionally. And this is still the species, this is still the description many primatologists continue to use. However, I think the weed macaque is a very, very unfortunate name, because weeds is not something that we like. And the moment you label these macaques as weed macaques, they have, I think, generated a sense of either not being important enough or being negative in a manner of speaking. So we therefore like to call them the anthropophilic macaques, those who love humans, or the prolific macaques because they have a life history trait of reproducing very, very rapidly, but we can talk about that later in the discussion. Therefore, to see a bonnet macaque or a rhesus macaque taking food like this from human sources is very common across the country. The rhesus macaque in North India, the bonnet macaque in southern India, peninsular India. But what is tragic, in a manner of speaking, is that this picture was taken in Bandipur National Park about 15 years ago. And therefore, what we are now seeing is what I called in the title the Synurbising of macaques, which means that each of these groups are slowly becoming urbanized. Now, this is an important philosophical point, I think. Every time anyone feeds a macaque, or every time we radio collar an elephant, or we put out a camera trap to look for rodents or tigers, we begin the process of urbanization of those individuals. Their lives will change forever. And hence, I think I would like to make a very important point here, which I personally believe in very strongly, that no research, no methodology that we use in our research while dealing with non-human beings is non-invasive. They are all invasive, they are all obtrusive, and they change the lives of these beings forever, right? In different ways. And again, this may be a point we should discuss after the talk. Oops, sorry. How do I get out of this? Oh, sorry, yes. Thank you. Yep. So I'm going to summarize a work done over 10 years, maybe actually more, in one slide. And I want to talk about how the urbanization process of these macaques, bonnet macaques, in Bandipur National Park has changed their lives forever, as I mentioned. And if you look at the right, the provision food from tourists, which has become very important. Any of you who've traveled from Mysore to Ooty would have seen people throwing out food to the macaques, and all the macaques lining up along the highway. You see this even in Rajaji National Park. If you go to Dehradun, these macaques have become so dependent on human food, and the human food is rich, it's clumped in distribution, right? And this has led to very intense competition between females within these groups. Now, why do I talk about the females? Because typically in macaques, as in many non-human primate societies, with the exception of the notable exception of the chimpanzees, are female bonded. So females live their entire lives in the natal troop, in the natal group where they were born, and they have to live with each other, adapt to each other in different ways. But when this kind of human food comes amidst them, it leads to intense competition between them. I don't have time to talk about the data, but again, I can bring this up later. And when this happens, one of the strategies females use, and this is unique to this population, is they start breaking up into smaller groups. And this is what we call group fission. And small groups of females then start emigrating from their natal groups. And these small groups of females now get monopolized in terms of their reproduction by a single male. And this has led, over the period of last 2 to 3 decades, it has led to a very unique social organization in the species, which is a unimale social organization where there is one adult male with a small group of several adult females. And this is a stable organization, very different from the large multi-male, multi-female associations that you find most, if not all, macaque species in. And this, again, let me highlight, has happened because primarily people have started feeding these macaques. Now, we have also, as a result of this change into unimale social organization, we now find even individual females leave these small unimale groups, either because of lack of female companionship or a lack of mate choice, which in these unimale groups they do not have. But it's also interesting how the males who take over these small groups of females perhaps are under genetic selection, where the more aggressive individuals are able to take over these small groups of females, or even more intriguingly, we raise the possibility that this might be a cultural tradition which individual male macaques learn from their fathers or from other predecessors, and therefore they may find themselves in a situation where they can decide whether to join unimale or multimale groups. But again, we'll talk about this later. Macaque sociality, as you can see, is very, very complex. And I want to just very quickly summarize the kind of sociality that we see in macaques. And remember that if I had said human sociality instead of macaque sociality, the slide would still apply. The first level of complexity in our lives, whether I'm a macaque or whether I'm a human, comes, of course, from the society, where, as you can see, we live in complex groups with individuals of different gender, age, dominance ranks, genetic relatedness living together. But within these societies, you also have subgroups or temporary alliances, long-term relationships, which cut across these categories. As a result of this social complexity, and this again, let me reiterate, applies to us as well, we find ourselves in a complex network of associations and interactions with many alternative strategies for survival and reproduction. Right? Over space, we have a choice of being in different kinds of networks. And the reason I talk about survival and reproduction is because those are the two currencies through which evolution works. But we are long-lived beings, and over time as well, individuals who live in these long-lived groups find different strategies that they can pursue during their lifetimes. When I grew up with my family, or when I went to school and then college, and I developed my own peer groups of friends, and later when I have my own family, and even later, perhaps, heaven forbid, if I have to live with my children, I find myself in very, very different social networks within which our strategies will have to keep changing, right? And forever, we are looking for ways that will maximize our benefits to ourselves, minimize the conflict that prevails in this society. And in order to be able to do that, the other level of complexity comes from ourselves as individuals, because each of us has a rich repertoire of communicative behaviors which will allow us to express ourselves individually and develop very complex social relationships. And if you think about all the relationships that each of you have, including that with your two parents, you will see that each relationship is unique. One cannot replace the other, and it required a tremendous amount of cognitive abilities for you to develop and maintain those relationships, break down some of them if necessary. And let me assure you that the macaque, individual macaque, has exactly the same challenge in their social life. Right. This, therefore, brings me to an extremely important point that I discussed with some of you earlier this afternoon, and which is that of individuality. Right? So here are pictures of 5 adult male macaques from 5 of our groups in Bandipur National Park, and clearly you can make them out one from the other by their unique hairstyles. But let me also assure you that each is a unique individual. And over the last more than 20 years that we have been studying these macaques in Bandipur, Mudumalai, where we now know more than 2,000 individuals by face, right? We don't have to tag them, we just know them by face. Each individual, like each individual human in this room, is unique. No short-term behavioral strategies are replicated across individuals. No long-term life history strategies are the same for any two individual macaques. And this is something that I would like to again impress upon you, because traditional zoological thinking has prevented us from thinking of non-humans as individual beings, but we've always thought of them in the collective. If you've seen one macaque, you've seen them all. If you see one cockroach, you've seen them all. But believe me, that's not true. By shoving their individuality under the carpet, I think we have done great disservice to these species, to these populations, to these groups. And I think the time has now come to bring back our studies from the level of species to those of the group, to those of the individual. But we can discuss this again later. Today, I want to talk very quickly about a few features of non-human primate lives, in this case macaques, that seem to become important under changing ecological regimes. And changing anthropogenic regimes is just one of them. The fact that they have to now live with humans, of course, is a very important force. But even otherwise, there are certain aspects of their life histories which I think required them to be able to change when ecological situations change. The first is phenotypic flexibility in social behavior. And let me summarize from our work in Bandipur the kind of flexibility that we see in individuals. Now, what is phenotypic flexibility? These are changes in behavior which occur within the lifetime of individuals, often reversibly, which means that these are not stable genetic changes. Of course, there may be changes in gene expression. There may be other physiological changes which allow such behavioral adaptability to come in. But this is again a sphere of investigation in non-humans that we have really neglected. We've often assumed that any kind of change that we see in non-humans is genetic. We will see them only across generations, and what we have therefore lost out on are opportunities to see how each individual within their lifetime are able to change their social as well as individual behavioral strategies. Now, so the unpredictability in food abundance and distribution that I talked about, especially with the coming of people, has led to group fission with female emigration, smaller group sizes of females, and also within these female groups, I've not had time to talk about it, we have now shown that individual females change their social strategies while dealing with other individual females in their group, depending not only on their dominance rank, but also on the ecological regime. So Sunita Ram, who did her master's dissertation with me about 20 years ago, maybe actually earlier, was able to show how in one group of bonnet macaques, the change in ecological regimes within the course of a day led to very stable but reversible changes in their social strategies, where patterns of aggression, patterns of affiliation changed over the course of the day, and this kept alternating between these different ecological regimes. That's how adaptable they are. Now, we have also now shown that once you have these different sized groups with different social organization, there is a flexibility in male behavioral and emigration strategies. And once you have the unimale organization that I talked about, there is flexibility in female emigration strategies, because when females suddenly find themselves in these small groups with not enough females to have social bonding with, or they don't have a choice of males to choose from in terms of their mating, they leave these groups and move to other groups. And all of this again is happening within the lifetime of these individuals. Let me move again through just one slide through the cognitive capacities which underlie complex behavioral actions. How is this phenotypic flexibility possible? It's possible because, again, we have completely neglected understanding how non-human beings, in this case macaques, take decisions, behavioral decisions. What are the mechanisms by which they are able to take usually an adaptable decision under very different socio-ecological situations, where they may have to take decisions within a matter of perhaps hours. And again, we can talk about this during the discussion, But have been our strategies. We have looked at social knowledge. We have looked at possible conceptual models of the self that these macaques may have. We've looked at tactical deception and tried to understand whether they can attribute beliefs to each other or whether they are intentional in these deceptive strategies. And the way we've done this is we have made theoretical constructs of individual mentalistic cognitive structures and processes within individuals, which we have looked through certain fundamental frameworks, including theory of mind, intentionality, attribution, referentiality. Again, I'm really sorry that I don't have time to talk about these individually now, but we can discuss this after the talk. But what I want to point out is that perhaps they have very complex lives because they have complex minds. And they are capable of mental processes which are a challenge for us to understand simply because they can't speak to us. I will suggest that I have no way, if I'm just spending a day with one of you whom I don't know very well and we don't talk to each other, I will be really hard pressed to decipher whether you have a mind or are you just mechanically responding through your behavior. The only reason I know you have a mind is because you talk to me and tell me what you're thinking of. Unfortunately, the macaques can't do that. And that has led to this assumption of the so-called simplicity of our thinking, where we say that perhaps they don't have a mind at all. We don't see any evidence of it. But then we don't have evidence of the mind in many of us as well, unless we talk to each other. And this, I think, is very important. We have also looked at referential gestures, multimodal communication, which I will talk about a bit later, the manufacture of tools and potential insights into causality of how tools function. We've looked at behavioral flexibility, social learning, and cultural traditions, which I'll also talk about. And these we have done through a very different kind of strategies. We have not constructed mental black boxes, but we've looked at functionally observable cognitive events, distributed cognitive processes which emerge from the behavioral coordination of interacting individuals. If I now look very hard at the door, and all of you follow my eye gaze and look at the door, we have fulfilled a behavioral coordination of a cognitive type, where you have thought within inverted commas that if Rana is looking at the door so pointedly, there must be something I need to look at the door, and you follow my eye gaze. And this is, again, a cognitive event, which is called a distributed cognitive event, because it's through our sharing of these behaviors and coordination of these behaviors that we achieve a cognitive task. And this is one way in which we can also start understanding the minds of non-human beings. Therefore, we make qualitative and quantitative observations, behavioral analyses, cognitive interpretations, and psychological constructs of the primate mind and its various mental states, in the hope that we will be able to understand what it is, finally, to be a macaque. Right? And finally, let us look at some individual behavioral traits and social traditions. I'm sure many of you know about Jane Goodall's work, where for the first time in the late 60s, she pointed out that chimpanzees have culture. Chimpanzees that she was studying were able to insert sticks into termite mounds, and when the termites bite onto the stick, they were able to bring out these sticks and harvest those termites sticking to those sticks. This was culture, because other chimpanzees were learning by observation from chimpanzees who were using this cultural strategy, culturally learned strategy. But what was also fascinating is that Jane found that in two populations of chimpanzees across the river Congo, they developed very different strategies for harvesting these termites. So in one group, on one side of the river, they would bring out the stick with the termites sticking to the stick and run it through their mouth and harvest the termites. In the other group, across the river, they would take the termite stick and collect all the termites between their two fingers and put it into their mouth. And this was learned by next generations. And here you have two cultural traditions addressing the same task, evolving differently in two populations. This was culture. And for the first time, though there were other studies, none of those studies drew this kind of attention that Jane's studies did. People were forced to question what then it meant to be a human, because at that time the belief was that only humans have culture. And instead of gleefully embracing chimpanzees as another species which have culture, people set up this task of making themselves, giving them themselves different definitions so that they would continue to be unique in the animal kingdom, right? What we now recognize is that, oh, I'm sorry. What we now recognize is that even macaques have very, very powerful cultures. And it's important to look at these social traditions because the individual behavioral traits, which even one individual may discover by learning or by trial and error experience, will give rise to a tradition through social learning. And this process serves in the generation of individuality and leads to increase in behavioral variation within the groups. If you look at each other and decide what really differentiates each of you from the person sitting next to you, it is culture. And what we are increasingly now recognizing is that in many non-human species groups, culture or behavioral traditions set themselves apart as well in terms of their individuality. And of course, I will not have time to go into it, but there are different kinds of behavioral patterns that you can decipher in these social traditions. There's rapid spread patterns, parent-offspring patterns, and stable group-specific patterns. Again, I'm sorry, but we can discuss this later. But what I want to point out here in this slide, again, I will not have time to go into the details, is we have discovered a number of behavioral traditions in bonnet macaques, in three populations of bonnet macaques, which include rapid spread patterns, parent-offspring patterns, and group-specific patterns. Again, we can discuss them later. These have been established by individuals and then they have moved down either horizontally, vertically, or obliquely. And this is how a tradition has been set up. Many of you may know about potato washing or wheat washing by Japanese macaques, which was established in the early 1950s, even before Jane Goodall actually talked about termite fishing and chimpanzees, but which was not recognized, unfortunately, by the Western world. So here is a video, and I wanted to show of two bonnet macaques, and we will focus on one of them here, two brothers, amongst a group of 5 brothers who came down to live for a few months on the river Moyar, which separates at some locations between Bandipur and Mudumalai, where these two brothers learned how to wash wild mangoes which came floating down the river Moyar before consuming them. Right? So here is the individual, and he has the mango in his hand. It's covered with slime. Maybe it's astringent paste. So he washes the mango. And then when he tastes it, perhaps it doesn't taste very good. It doesn't, because I've tasted them too. But then he washes them, perhaps to remove the sap. And then with his left hand, as you will see, he removes a speck of something from it, washes his hands in the water, so he's using water as a tool, and then he keeps the mango under his foot and uses it. So he's now looking for it, but it's interesting that the way he looks for it, he clearly has a pattern in his mind. He's not picking up pebbles or stones, he's feeling his way down. So he's feeling for the mango, he's not able to find it, and when he does find it, he washes it again. Right. Now, so this was, of course, about washing mangoes. But what's also interesting is of all the behavioral traditions that I talked about in the previous slide, only some of them were persistent. Some died out, just as they happen in human communities as well. And there has been very interesting debates about why cultures arise, why cultures die out in non-humans. But the point remains that when cultures do appear and when they become stable, they can really make a difference to their lives. And here I'm going to talk about another cultural tradition which is remarkable in other ways as well. And this is a new form of multimodal signaling that we have discovered in the bonnet macaques of Bandipur National Park, where we have started, members of one group, juveniles of one group, have started communicating with humans who carry food in their hands, right? Uh, this video is not very good, but there's a faint coo call. And then they hold out a hand. No. The hand is held out before they're chased off. And we did experimental trials, and we have now, which are in the field, where we have now established that it's the sight of a human being carrying food which triggers off this communication system, but it's a system that they don't use with conspecifics. They don't use it with other macaques in their group for one simple reason, that humans are willing to share food with macaques, but no two bonnet macaques, even mother and offspring, will share food amongst themselves. So that's the coo call, and that's the hand being raised. So sorry, again, the video is not great. But basically, what we now find, and we call this affected food requesting, because the humans to whom this appeal is made are also extremely interested in sharing food with them. And this is unique because it involves several behavioral components, including the coo call and the hand extension gesture, which we think is remarkable because it's only done, the macaque will only raise their hand when there is eye contact made with the person holding the food. If the individual looks away, they will track the eye movement of the human, they will follow the human, orient with them, and only when their eyes finally meet, they'll keep calling, giving the coo calls, but when the eyes meet, they will hold up their hand. And this, of course, is an evolution of a completely new intentional and possibly referential visual signal, but it's displayed by only juvenile bonnet macaques because it's an alternative strategy, because they cannot threaten individuals and get food from them, nor can they snatch away food, which adults can. And so they have evolved a completely different strategy as a juvenile to get food, right? And this we now know has been established or had been established as a distinct behavioral tradition in one camp group in Bandipur. Of course, this behavior is slowly disappearing, and I can talk about that later at the end of it. So this was a slide where I wanted to talk about how do you know whether a particular behavior is intentional? What is the intentionality underlying it? And we have now devised ways in which we can establish whether a particular behavior is indeed intentional or not. But again, maybe I will take this up, or I can just tell you briefly, it is a social signal directed at specific recipients. They are sensitive to the attentional state of the audience. They manipulate the attentional state of the audience if necessary. They monitor the response of the audience, and they persist in this behavior until a goal is met. Once they receive food, they move away and they don't repeat this again, right? So these are hallmarks of intentionality in this. So let me very quickly now just spend another 5 minutes on the urban macaques. And this is, of course, some work that we've been doing with rhesus macaques in Delhi and Guwahati. And of course, we know that these macaques have adapted remarkably to the infrastructure that they find themselves in an urban environment. And this is the arboreality that the rhesus macaque shows, where they use these tangles of electric wires to make their way, which has many, many kinds of repercussions subsequently, which again, we'll talk about later. But what is also remarkable is the adaptability that many of these individuals show towards human resources, which they now want to acquire of their own. And there's a whole body of studies that need to understand both cognitively and behaviorally how this adaptability is reached. What are the mechanisms without danger. We now have, this is not our data, but data from our colleagues who have documented a series of lifestyle disorders in the urban rhesus macaques of Delhi, which includes hypercholesteremia, diabetes, and a whole range of other kinds of issues that is affecting their mortality rates. Uh, but what I would like to draw your attention to is their behavioral adaptation to these complex situations. So here is a video which some of you might have already seen. It was documented in Jaku Temple in Shimla in October 2020. And there's a very, I thought was a very entertaining commentary in Hindi with this, which I would like to show you and we can quickly discuss.
ये टारगेट लॉक करके चला है, टारगेट सामने है और आपको दिखाता हूँ। ये पूरी प्लानिंग के साथ काम करते हैं यहाँ पे, फुल प्लानिंग अटैक के लिए जाते हुए ये मूव किया है। टारगेट ये है इनका और ये देखिए मूव किया है और अभी एक्शन के लिए तैयार है। और ये आपको दिखा रहा हूँ मैं, रेडी टू एक्शन एंड अटैक। और ये चश्मा लेके ये देखिए जबरदस्त ये अटैक, ये चश्मा जा चुका है और अब 20 रुपए, इसको 20 रुपए का प्रसाद खिलाया जाएगा तो ये चश्मा वापस करेगा। एक जबरदस्त। अब ये देखिए, ये अपने जो इनकी सेफ पॉइंट है उन पे जाके बैठते हैं और अभी आपको पूरी वीडियो दिखाता हूँ। ये देखना जी, ये 20 रुपए का इसको प्रसाद दिया जा रहा है, ये देखो। और ये चश्मा गिरा दिया इसने, ये चश्मा वापस मिल गया। ये जाखू मंदिर में जो मंकी है ये इनका प्रोफेशन है, एक शानदार एक्सपर्ट मंकी है, एक जबरदस्त हमारा भी एक्सपीरियंस।
Right. So clearly, macaques have learned to live with us, to negotiate with us, and also they have learned the value we place on objects. And the shopkeepers in Jaku Temple will tell you that if they take your handkerchief or your newspaper, 10 rupees prasad will do the trick. But if they've taken your mobile or your glasses, unless you give them 20 rupees worth of prasad, they will not drop them back. So clearly, this is a barter system that they've learned. This is not new. People have documented this in other species. So, for example, in the long-tailed macaques of Uluwatu Temple in Bali, where they follow the same strategies. We've seen Hanuman langurs do this in Benares as well. So clearly, these are complex macaque narratives that we need to understand further to see how they have adapted to us, but it's also us who depend on them. And so here on the left is Mahesh Bhai, who sells bananas in Jangpura extension in Delhi, and every morning he fills up the water tank behind him with 3 tankers of water so that the macaques on the hot summer Delhi day will continue to be there, and he sits with his bananas, and there are people who stop to buy bananas only for the macaques. So the macaques make their living, the, Mahesh Bhai makes his living, and these lead to certain kinds of economic subsistence that we've not documented before. But there are also other kinds of narratives, what we call microspaces of health. We've met people who have recovered from clinical depression simply by feeding macaques and developing relationship with the macaques. So they said that they don't have to go to a hospital because just by being with the macaques, maybe in Hanuman Temple and Chandni Chowk, is enough, on Connaught Place in Delhi, is enough for them to feel good and they feel themselves worthwhile simply because of the kind of exchanges that they have with even particular individual macaques. However, these have led to what we call ecologies of concern. Many of you are aware of the kind of very difficult conflictual situations that we now have with macaques across urban centers, with detriment to the well-being of both humans and macaques. And here I would like to point out that it is very important to look at the welfare implications of all our actions, of our thoughts, of our interactions with these other non-human beings. But I also want to distinguish between welfare and well-being. Welfare is what we think is good for non-human beings. Well-being is what they themselves think about their state of being. And I think we now are in urgent need to develop methods processes by which we can distinguish between what we think is welfare and what they think is well-being. In other words, I think it's time to give macaques a voice to express. And this is not true for macaques alone, it's true for many, many others of non-human beings that we interact with. So finally, to conclude, what is it like to be a macaque? And here I summarize some of our findings. It's to just tell you how complex it is to be a macaque. They are inherently capable of solving various social and technical problems and make complex decisions influenced by their experiential knowledge. Individual macaques appear to possess social knowledge of themselves and of their group members. They attribute intentionality to others. They employ conspecific referential gestures where they point to parts of their body that they want groomed to other members of their group. But they also develop heterospecific multimodal communication systems. They use tools that they often manufacture with possible insights into their causality. They understand the functioning of a tool, is what we have evidence for now. Individual macaques therefore form rudimentary mental representations which are generated by their personal experience. They have an understanding of where they fit into the dominance hierarchy that prevails in the group. They have an idea of where their social companions fit into this hierarchy. They recognize to a limited extent their own mental states and those of their social companions, and they form primitive cognitive representations of their selves, allowing themselves to make decisions about self-referential behaviors. What should they direct towards their own bodies versus what should they direct towards other bodies or even other minds? And finally, they appear to be unusual in exhibiting remarkable social flexibility, a wide variety of behavioral strategies and cultural traditions established through social learning, all of which allow them to successfully adapt to very different kinds of, as I said, socioecological habitats, especially very difficult human-generated regimes. Right? Finally, I think what we should also draw attention to the fact is that perhaps the rhesus macaque and the bonnet macaque, which we've always thought of as pests, at least most of us have, which we think are everywhere, that we don't need to bother about them, are actually endangered. Urban macaques are fast disappearing, and there has been this dwindling or disappearance of these groups across their distribution range, again driven by anthropogenic factors and occasionally their usual adaptive changes, some of which can become maladaptive under these conditions. We need more detailed ecological and behavioral studies of so-called wild, but of course, even 2,000 years ago, if they lived with us, then they're not really wild in the sense of pristine idea of being wild, which is again a very Western concept. Semi-urban, urban macaques, we need to understand their anthropogenic behaviors, their life history traits, and the different consequences that our thinking, our actions have on their survival. And finally, we need to develop very effective management strategies for many of these groups in protected areas with tourist-wildlife interactions and in urban areas with severe conflict between the species with very little hope for the survival of these macaques. I think one of the reasons why we've stopped collecting further data on our long-term studies on bonnet macaques in Bandipur and Mudumalai has been that the Forest Department not only has stopped giving us permission to work on them, but in many cases they've actually caught illegally these macaques and translocated them within a protected area, which to us is completely unacceptable. But then again, these are complex stories, which perhaps we'll talk about later. I want to end this talk so that we have more time for discussion with, again, a poem. I sometimes think that maybe poetry would have been a far stronger tool to have understood, to have used to understand the lives of the macaques that we have, because many a time I think poets have that insight which many, many years of our scientific research are not able to encapsulate the same way. Now, here is a painting by Peter Bruegel, the elder, from what is now the Netherlands. And this is a 16th century painting where Bruguel describes two I think these are Cercocebus monkeys from Africa who are chained to a wall, and behind you see the city of Delft in the Netherlands, which was a great colonial power, and there was prosperity. There are ships sailing out to the tropical lands, bringing back human and non-human captives who they then exploit in different ways. You know the colonial history of many of our lands. And there was a poet whom I've always admired very much, Wisława Szymborska from Poland, and she wrote this poem in 1957 when she was visiting the Dahlem Museum, where this painting was kept, and she saw this painting of Peter Bruegel and wrote this poem, and I want to end my talk with this. This is what I see in my dreams about final exams. Two monkeys chained to the floor sit on the windowsill. The sky behind them flutters. The sea is taking its bath. The exam is history of mankind. I stammer and hedge. One monkey stares and listens with mocking disdain. The other seems to be dreaming away. But when it's clear, I don't know what to say. He prompts me with a gentle clinking of his chain. Thank you. Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Right. Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. No. So I would like to look upon the macaques here as representatives of the many, many species or groups or individuals of non-humans that you very rightly point to. And the plea that I make is that we have spent very little time or effort or resources to really understand the kind of decision making that goes on in their daily lives. So while you're absolutely right that this is true for perhaps dolphins, it's true for elephants, it's true for dogs or cats in our home, it's perhaps also true for many so-called solitary species who still need to map and know where other individual solitary beings are and attune their behavior to these. The point I want to make is that perhaps macaques are not unique at all, except that we don't talk about these decisions. And this becomes even more important. I would like to extend the point that you're making to say that when we interact with them, either when we exploit non-human beings or even when we try to conserve non-human groups, we pay very little attention to what is it that they are capable of, what is it that they want. I think it will be foolish on our part to not to believe that non-human beings also have a desire of certain kinds of roles that they want to play in the communities that they live in or the environments that they live in. So isn't it time for us to understand how complex those decisions are and attune our responses to them in the light of what they might be capable of achieving on their own? So I think it's a more general plea. No way is this unique to macaques. You're absolutely right, but we need to understand other beings as well. Very, very strongly so, I feel. Sure, sure.
So those kind of behavioral change or behavioral patterns you observe,
Yeah,
are they local or you can say global?
very nice. I would like to say they are local, simply because I have not looked at other groups, other individuals, I mean within limits, but also, very importantly, these complex mechanisms operate differently in different groups and across different individuals. They have their own individual capacities. So while I think these are general understandings of what macaques are capable of achieving, how they actually solve these problems or how they actually achieve their goals may be very different achieved across groups or across individuals. And hence, I think these are local truths, but then I would argue that in all our science that we do, the truths that we discover by and large for complex beings are local. Local in space, local in time. Over time, they may develop other capabilities, they may lose some of these capabilities, and we just need to understand the complexity of the situation within which they're taking decisions to get a much fuller understanding of what they're capable of. Yes, I think very important point. Thank you very much.
Really nice talk.
Thank you.
I had this question that you mentioned about female bonnet macaques. They usually leave the group. So, what are the odds of them getting into a new group, and how do they get accepted by the group, and what is the hierarchy of?
Okay, very nice question. Thank you again very much. The first and the foremost point is that there are no general patterns, right? We have seen, for example, in Bandipur, an elderly female bonnet macaque who lived alone for several months before she disappeared, right? She may have joined other groups, she may have died, we do not know. We have seen a pair of female bonnet macaques who persisted for 3 months, lived on their own, just the two of them, because they had left a group, and they joined another group from which one of the individuals disappeared. We don't know whether she died or she moved on, whereas the other female continues to be there even today. This is 10 years down the line. So clearly they make these decisions and they're capable of even surviving on their own, talking about females, just as they're true for males as well. And so when they decide to join another group, which group they will join remains an open question. Let me just say about the hierarchy. Now, this is an interesting point, so let me take this opportunity to quickly tell you something which is fascinating about the macaques. If you look at the dominance hierarchy amongst the males, it's very biologically determined. In the sense, the strongest male macaque will rise up to the dominant position and they will fight with each other, they will form coalitions, they will engage in politics where the group will challenge another group of friends, and then within the group there will be a power tussle. It's very complex how they rise up, but it's biologically determined. So if you plot age of male bonnet macaques with their position in the hierarchy, you get a bell-shaped curve. So you're very subordinate when you're young, but as you become a full-bodied male, mature male, you can potentially reach the top dominance positions, and then as you age, you start falling in the hierarchy. If you come to the females, so there's a change in male dominance positions over their lifetime. When you come to females, it's very stable. So most female macaques have the same position in the hierarchy throughout their lifetimes, but it's culturally determined. So if you are born to a dominant female, you will be dominant to all the other females and their daughters. So entire matrilines have dominance ranks, and that doesn't change, except under certain circumstances. So it's a bit like if you're born into a Brahmin family, whether you like it or not, you're a Brahmin. If you're born into a non-Brahmin family, like it or not, you're a non-Brahmin. It's exactly like that. You may be lame or you may be blind, but if you're born to a dominant female, you will be dominant to others. And what is fascinating is within a particular group of macaques here, you have two completely different sets of mechanisms which determine your dominance positions. Coming back to the females, and I'll end with this, when you come back to the females, when they move from one group to another, it's a coded information that you will be the most subordinate, right? So we have seen cases, for example, where a female established a group, 3 juvenile females from another group, and we know that they're sisters because they look very similar to each other, came and joined, and they were, of course, below her in the hierarchy. When these 3 females were juvenile females and they moved as juveniles, when they reached sexual maturity, they actually fought the female, and all 3 of them went above her. So it is also possible for females to change their positions, but it's under very, very specific conditions. So it's again a complex story, but by and large, that's how the dominance hierarchy gets established. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for the enlightening talk.
Thank you.
I actually have a question about Dr. Goodall's observation.
Sure.
So there were 2 groups of chimpanzees on both sides of the river,
Right.
and they were having 2 different cultures.
Correct.
So if 2 different individuals from 2
groups were
Yeah.
taken together and they bred, then what would happen to the offspring? Like which culture would they form?
Yeah, I do
Will
not
it
know.
be?
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting thought experiment because these experiments have never been done. The point is, I think it would depend again on the individual experience of young individual to have experienced if she can or if they can both the kinds of strategies, but it could depend perhaps on what the mother was doing or the foster mother was doing, because you may pay more attention to the foster mother. We don't really understand the mechanisms by which social learning gets regulated as well. However, there have been cross-fostering examples in macaques on their vocal communication. And what we've seen, again, is in very limited experiments that they've done, is there some components of the vocalization which is innate. So individuals, even if they're cross-fostered by a mother of another species, will continue to produce some calls which is typical of its original species identity, but there are some calls which they adopt by watching their mother. So clearly, again, like most complex behavioral traits, which include vocalization, there are innate, inherited components, and there are components that are culturally or socially learned, which are then produced. How this would turn out in the case of tool use or manufacture is something perhaps that will again vary from case to case, but we haven't done these observations. We haven't had these experiments done.
Sir, so my question was that all the living beings are they can they be treated as individuals, and what does individuality mean?
You've touched upon a very, very deep philosophical point, right? And so I would argue, and this is a personal viewpoint, that yes, whichever species of organisms we consider, I would like to look at individuals. It is true that for very simple organisms, the differences across individuals may be less than they would be for more complex beings. That's a given, but I would still like to think there are individuality. There is individuality in this. Let me give you an example from bacteria. So we know that bacteria live in these large colonies, and it would seem that there may be very little individuality across bacterial cells, but we do know under certain circumstances when bacterial sheets are formed, for example, or there are certain changes in their organization of the colony, there are certain individual bacteria which start producing chemical signals which are received by other cells and they respond to these signals. So these are communication signals. The interesting question is, we still don't understand which individuals produce these signals and why. Why those individuals? The fact that you cannot predict which individuals will produce the signal tells you that there is individuality there as well. So it really depends on how you define individuality, which was your next question. Now, this is a very interesting philosophical debate. So if you look at, let's say, a butterfly, right, which goes through different stages, right? So you have the eggs, and then you have the larva, you have the pupa, and then you have the adult. Do they represent one individual? Or are they four individuals? So there have been different definitions of individuality, developmental individuals, spatially segregated individuals, or if you look at hydra or jellyfishes, which go through different kind of developmental stages, or if you look at a clonal organism. So you have this fungus in Michigan, which is apparently believed to be the largest individual organism, the oldest, right? So when you have these fungal mycelia growing and when they get detached, or if you have a strawberry plant which vegetatively propagates and they get dissociated, are they different individuals? Are they the same individuals? When a cell undergoes binary fission and you have two daughter cells, where is the mother? Is one of them still the mother? And we do know that in many of these cases, even with simple organisms, we have epigenetic changes, right? We have epigenetic traits which are acquired, which may be the mitochondria, let's say in the case of a eukaryotic daughter cell, or let's say the zygote, which inherits mitochondria from the mother, the egg cell, right? So, but there may be a few mitochondria which come from the sperm as well, or there may even be horizontal transfer. So how do you generate individuality in these clonal organisms, otherwise clonal organisms, needs to be debated and defined. But I think the important point is we need to start recognizing individuality across living beings, whatever be their species, because I think that's been neglected for too long. So, yeah.
So,
Yeah, I can hear you. No, I can hear you with the mic. I think the mic's working.
hello?
Yeah.
So, at one point, you were talking about maladaptation.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Yeah, so the way maladaptation works is it's contingency. It's by chance, right? It's by chance in the sense that when you face a very bewildering new situation, you respond to it behaviorally in a particular way that you think is most appropriate at that point. But in the long term, that behavior may make it maladaptive for you to continue to survive or exist in that situation. So let us say, look at these macaques. Once they start adapting to human foods, in the long run, what we've shown is that it leads to splintering of their society, females leave, the mortality rate of these females go up when they break out of the group, simply because with small groups, they are less defensive, their defense mechanisms don't work as well. Therefore, they fall prey to leopards much more easily. But even more importantly, when you have a small group of macaques, a car accident where 2 or 3 individuals of a group of 6 or 7 die, it decimates the group. So the fact that you're coming down to the road and you are following cars itself is maladaptive. Because though temporarily you may get richer sources of food, ultimately you have higher mortality rates. Or look at the obese rhesus macaques of Delhi who are dying of diabetes, of hypercholesteremia. These are maladaptive traits simply because you are adapting to these food sources and you are acquiring them, but in the long run it doesn't work. So will the genetic selection kick in under these conditions? So will a macaque who refuses an ice cream cone survive longer and leave behind more progeny, all of who reject ice cream cones, is something that time will tell us. And if they do reject an ice cream cone, that will be a positively adaptive response as opposed to a maladaptive response of eating whatever is offered to them. We have seen sambar being fed chips by tourists in Bandipur where they have eaten up the polythene pack as well. And of course, that doesn't bode very well in the long term for the health of these individuals. But will they learn over time to not consume the plastic packets? That's what I'm referring to as maladaptive traits. Yeah.
So thank you, sir. It was a very nice talk.
Thank you very much.
So I have just one question. What I have understood so far, behavior, what we are talking about in this case, is a qualitative trait, right? So it can't be quantified in that manner. But when we are talking about the cognitive abilities of these primates, like these macaques, there must be some cognitive basis, like some neurological data, like
Correct.
brainwave study or something.
Correct.
So is there any basis on that we are like hypothesizing about these behaviors and everything?
Sure. So that's a complex question. Firstly, the traits we are talking about are not necessarily all qualitative. There can also be quantification that is performed on some of these traits, whether in the wild or in captivity. We can quantify abilities. But of course, I want to draw attention to the fact that sometimes you see behaviors which are so rare and you have so few observations on them, we have to treat them as qualitative data, right? And I think that's important. I think the fact that we don't have quantification possible in certain cases should not be a reason why we ignore those behaviors, because those are perhaps critically important for the survival of those individuals. That's one point. The second point is, of course, there have been studies, for example, in the laboratory where you have asked macaques to perform very perceptually or cognitively complex tasks and which they have achieved. And there you can actually look at neuronal mechanisms which underlie some of these problem-solving tasks. Of course, they are difficult often to interpret. In many cases, if you fail to find, if you fail to, let's say, replicate a particular task, it could be motivational, or it could be a faulty design of the experiment, in which case these would be philosophically called bad experiments, because if you get a positive result, you know something. If you get a negative result, you can say nothing about why it failed. So there are limitations to actually looking at the physiological or the cognitive, neurocognitive underpinnings of many of these behaviors that we see. And therefore, I think it's important that even if we don't understand the biological basis of many of these so-called, let's say, qualitative behavioral traits, which are newly arisen traits, I think they are still important to consider, because it might be the starting point of evolution of these traits. Also, they may promote the survival or reproduction of many of these individuals, and so they will be what are called evolutionarily significant traits. So I think we need to open ourselves up when we are dealing with complex systems, living in complex environments. And I think every observation that you make, whether qualitative or quantitative, is important, because it tells you something about the life history of these individuals.
Okay, I know we have a lot of questions here, but we'll take one last one right here. After that, feel free to kidnap Rana and take him out, because I think the auditorium needs to shut down and some people need to go back home. You can take him outside, maybe go to the cafeteria and discuss over a coffee. So, last question, it's going to be good.
Sir, as you have mentioned that unpredictability of the food abundance leads to the group fusion and female immigration,
Right.
and also the male monopolization. So I am just curious to know, is it possible that it will eventually leads to monogamy behavior? And if food still, like if food availability still rise, then it will eventually the monogamy behavior is still present, and not only the many female one male interaction.
I see. Yeah. So thank you again for that question. You know, the current understanding in behavioral ecology of any species of organisms, be they birds or mammals, I'm not talking about invertebrates yet. Uh, the understanding is that there are no functionally monogamous species. There are always extra pair copulations. There are always mate choice decisions that individuals make. People have now shown, even in chimpanzees or in gibbons, individuals sneaking out, even nocturnally, to find other individuals, mate with them. Birds of prey, for example, raptors, where even when they are nesting and a male and a female are bringing up nestlings, and you know, in the raptors, it's extremely important for both to be present. In fact, if one individual, one parent dies for whatever reason, often the other parent will abandon the nest and the nestlings, because it's almost impossible to bring up and fully fledge the nestlings alone. So they will in fact go and find another mate and they will establish another nest, unless it's too late in the season. But what people have shown, even with raptors, is when they are monogamously, within quotes, bonded, and one individual is going out, whether it's the male or the female going out to procure food, if they get an opportunity, they will meet with other individuals. And which is why the counter strategy of the mate, when they return to the nest, whether it's a male or a female, is they undergo hundreds of copulatory acts every time an individual returns back to the nest with food. And the reason why they keep copulating, earlier they thought this was a kind of establishment of social bond. Now people believe, there's a hypothesis, that you're basically flushing out any other sperm that may be in the tract, in the reproductive tract. And so they repeatedly copulate. So therefore, it's not very clear that there are any purely monogamous species. But yes, in some sense, in the bonnet macaques, it is true that females may have a limited opportunity to leave the group. So as long as they're in a unimale group, they often don't have a choice but to mate with the single male. But we've also shown, or we've also seen, in many cases, very, very strong female mate choice, where a female will persistently reject the dominant male, will refuse to mate with him, will keep running away over a period of a few hours. And when you think that she is not receptive, which is why she's rejecting the male, she will quietly go out with the subordinate male, leave the group, copulate many, many times with him, and they will both return back to the group separately, right? So even in this particular case, where there is male monogamy, male monopoly over reproduction, females have counter strategies to escape this. So in that sense, what you're saying makes a lot of sense, but I doubt whether you will ever reach pure monogamy in any species, including humans.
Okay, excellent life lessons there. So, like I said, feel free to kidnap Ranada and just take him out for a coffee or in the cafeteria or something. But on behalf of NISER, can we have a big round of applause?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your patience, and thank you for your questions, and thank you. And my only hope is that the next time you see a macaque, you'll look at her